Welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, August 1st, 2025. Happy August. Today we are going to be talking about the North Carolina Senate race and a brand new poll from Emerson College showing Governor Roy Cooper with his lead of about 6 to 7 points across the state as he goes into an expected to be very competitive Senate election. The North Carolina poll coming from Emerson shows Roy Cooper, with this advantage across the state, holds a very clear name ID advantage while simultaneously holding an advantage amongst voters in an eventual general election when they are asked, who would you vote for, Michael Whatley, the Republican nominee for Senate, or Governor Roy Cooper, the Democratic nominee for Senate? And the reason why this is significant is because we have yet to see any primary polling data out of the state of North Carolina for quite some time in the general election prior to the data points that have been released. Today, we see that Emerson College and Victory Insights really stand to be the only main sources of polling in this state, besides some hypotheticals that were taken months ago against Tom Tillis and Laura Trump, dating all the way back to right after the 2024 presidential election. And so to see today numbers coming out of Emerson College Victory Insights, which is a poll that the GOP was aligned with in their most recent data point, also shows Roy Cooper with an advantage across the state. You are finding that it is pretty significant that Roy Cooper comes into the Senate race with anything of an advantage, because North Carolina really hasn't trended that way in a long time for the Democratic Party. When Roy Cooper was announced his bid that he was going to run for Senate, it really did shake up the race. But it also made it so there was going to be a Democrat who had near universal name ID. And it very much looks like that's going to pay off. While I don't doubt that Michael Whatley will build up his name ID across the state, it will never rival that of the former governor of this state, and it certainly won't be respected or revered to the same degree that Cooper was and is across this state. And there's a reason why he starts out with this advantage, leaving room for Roy Cooper to actually expand this lead, with about 12% of voters saying that they are quote-unquote undecided in this race, that by the time you reach November of 2026, I don't doubt that this race will narrow up, and I don't think that Roy Cooper will win by 6 points, but it is possible that Cooper ends up at 51, 52, 53%, depending on how the undecideds break. Now, Emerson College in specific has actually been quite accurate in North Carolina in years past. In the 2024 election, they released their final poll in October of 2024, showing Donald Trump with about a 3-point win over Kamala Harris, 2-point win rather, over Kamala Harris in this state. By the time we reached the eventual election, Donald Trump ended up expanding this lead from 2 points to 3.2% on election day over Vice President Harris. And so to see President Trump get a 1-point improvement might think that we are seeing Emerson underestimate the support of that of Donald Trump. But in those final 2 weeks, between October 24th and the time we had reached Election Day, the numbers had actually improved for Donald Trump by about a point nationwide across almost every single battleground state. So this actually makes a lot of sense. And at brass tacks, North Carolina was accurately predicted by Emerson College. But this isn't the first time. They also did it in the governor's race too. They found that Josh Stein would beat Mark Robinson by about 12 points. He ended up winning by about 15. So in some cases, underestimated Democratic support. But also back in 2022, the last time North Carolina had a Senate race up. Now, they released their early estimations. They did so very, very early on in this race. This was, April of 2022, earlier than traditional, but way later than where we are today. But that was because the primary was in full swing. There wasn't going to be a very clear indication that Ted Budd was going to easily win this, primary without the endorsement of Donald Trump. Pat McCrory, the former Republican governor, was running across the state. And so there was certainly some conversation about the primary being more competitive. So there wasn't an immediate full steam ahead into a general election like we are seeing today. But the most important part of this isn't as much to do with how voters viewed Ted Budd on the primary level, but rather how they viewed the general election. We essentially saw that in hypotheticals, if Ted Budd was to be the Republican nominee against Sherry Beasley, who had served as the Chief Justice of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, he leads her by about 7 points in those early estimations. And by the time you reach the eventual results, yes, Ted Budd defeated Sherry Beasley in this state, but they got more accurate as they got closer towards Election Day, November 2nd, 2022, just days before voters got to the ballot box for the 22 midterms, said Ted Budd would win by a margin of roughly 5 points across the state. So they saw him and they said, you know what, he's going to win this election. And come to find out in that Senate race in 2022, Ted Budd is winning by about 3.2%. And so when I saw those numbers and I saw that Emerson had historically gotten it very right in North Carolina, it is interesting now that they are seeing Roy Cooper with such a strong lead this early on in the race. I mean, a 6-point advantage is honestly larger than what I thought we would see come through the pipeline. As we saw, Roy Cooper, despite being the former popular governor, was running for a nationalized race for the first time in his electoral history. Roy Cooper has a very strong electoral history. Don't get me wrong. When you take a look at the past and you take a look at, where he is and what you find, you'll see that it is Roy Cooper who has been this this very straightforward candidate who has not lost an election in North Carolina since he started running for office, but most of it, in fact, all of it, has been largely contained to the state's boundaries. And so when you see that he first started, if you look at the electoral history, you can go back to his time in the state legislature, whether it's state senate or state house, but the focus here should be statewide races. That's what he's running for after all. In 2000, he won by about 6 points. 2004, won by about 11 points. 2008, won by over 20 points. 2012, Republicans didn't even field a candidate against him in the election. Then he won in the 2016 governor's race despite Donald Trump winning on the national level in North Carolina, expanded his margin in 2020, and now he's deciding to run for Senate. But like I said, no nationalized races before. I honestly thought that this race would start out with Whatley and Cooper in a closer position. Now, Victory Insights did come in and say that Cooper and Whatley together are close, and they also saw that the NRSC did a push poll through Victory Insights that essentially made voters, not a push poll, but they made voters in the undecided column say you have to choose, to which Whatley did have an advantage over Cooper. But again, I'm much more inclined to believe the data points from Emerson College, who historically had a much better track record in this state rather than a poll that had been funded by the NRSC. But the point is, even then, Victory Insights shows Cooper with an advantage overall, right? An advantage that even when you do find that there are some undecideds, when leaners are asked who do you choose, and then they actually force everyone to choose, and then you get the result the Republican Party desires, Cooper starting out with an advantage is a great place to be going into this race. Starting out at 47% is a great place to be, because even in his peak polling against Laura Trump or Roy Cooper, you didn't find him at 47%, except for once with Change Research and 48%, and tying it back in March of 2025, again, against one of the most unpopular senators in the entire country. And so to see this now, Roy Cooper is in a good position. I mean, the data here suggests that he's on track for a victory in North Carolina. Now, it won't come easy, and I don't think it'll be 6 points by the time we reach Election Day. I think that if Roy Cooper is to win this Senate race, it'll be by 1.5 or 2 points, because North Carolina is still a state that leans more towards the Republicans than it does the Democrats. And 2026, while it might be a good year for Democrats, even in 2018, at the best for Democrats, they came in just about 2 points of winning the popular vote in North Carolina. And the big reason why that, the Democrats actually lost the popular vote in North Carolina is because of an uncontested race over here on the eastern side of North Carolina, that if Democrats had just run a random candidate who got about a third of the vote, which is what you would expect from that race, Democrats actually would have won the popular vote in North Carolina in the House elections. And so that is the type of environment the Democrats would be working with. But even then, with throwing in that Democratic candidate, North Carolina only leans towards the Democrats in 2018 by about a point and a half. And so that's what I think that we are on track to see with Roy Cooper. But of course, it is always good for the data to say that he's doing as well as Democrats would have hoped him to do, because that is the whole point of why he's running for Senate, because he's somebody Democrats adamantly believe can win this Senate race. And Democrats haven't won a Senate race in North Carolina since 2008. I mean, you have to go way back to find the last time, and it was Kay Hagan who defeated Elizabeth Dole in the North Carolina Senate race by about 8.5 points, largely due to the huge wave in Democratic support in the 2008 election. I mean, Democrats came off of this election and mid-2009 with 60 seats in the U.S. Senate. I kid you not, a filibuster-proof majority. Today, Democrats hold about 47 seats. So a huge change between 2008 and today. But that's not my point. My point is that North Carolina was a prime target for Democrats then. They invested heavily in it, and they got it. But they haven't gotten it since. 2010, unlucky. 2014, unlucky. 2 red wave years, back-to-back Senate races. Of course, you're going to lose North Carolina. Then Trump's on the ballot. Then in 2018, a blue wave year. North Carolina, no Senate race to be seen. 2020, Donald Trump wins North Carolina. So does Tom Tillis by near identical margins. In 2022, and obviously, an unforced error in the North Carolina Senate race. When you look at 2022, Democrats in the incumbency, they're not going to win North Carolina. Ted Budd wins by 3.2%, which actually was, and this is what I think should warn some Republicans, that 2022 in North Carolina should not have been this close, right? All the data suggested that it was going to be Ted Budd winning by 6 or 7 points. Every single data point, Republican, Democratic, independent aligned firms, whoever it was, from a university to Data for Progress to Trafalgar, all of them said Ted Budd was going to win by 6 or 7. he won by 3.2. And it was this polling lead that maintained itself throughout near the entirety of the cycle that resulted in Democrats not really investing in this state. By the time you reached August, you found the National Democratic Party had focused their resources elsewhere, and I don't think they were ever going to win the North Carolina Senate race. But you did see that I think a lot of it, and the reason why they pretty much advocated responsibility and gave it off to the North Carolina Democratic Party was because they thought this race was moving in a direction that wasn't going to be positive for them. But of course, if the National Party doesn't invest, the race is going to move in a direction that isn't positive for them. And so if Ted Budd had a 6-point lead on Election Day, won by 3, one could contend that at the peak here for Cheri Beasley, where she was down just a point, maybe she could have actually came through, or maybe the race would have looked very different if Democrats had maintained investments in this state. But I still maintain North Carolina would have voted for the Republican Party in 2022, but I do think that margin could have been closer, and even without the National Democratic Party investing to the extent and to the degree they did in states like Pennsylvania, and across the board, honestly, too, in Arizona and Nevada, 2022's North Carolina Senate race should be a sign for the GOP that sometimes these more nationalized races aren't actually as favorable for the GOP as they otherwise might think. And that maybe it is Donald Trump being on the ballot that has largely led them to electoral success and not necessarily just the advantage that the Republican Party has. And we're starting to see that come through. Because if it was just a clear-cut advantage for the GOP, Roy Cooper would have no shot of being a senator from this state. I mean that honestly. And I mean that because if the Republican Party, who had run very, very close elections against popular Democratic governors before, had been as locked in North Carolina as they had been in other states, especially on races on the Senate level, you would never even have seen a chance that Democrats could have been able to come close to this. I mean, we've seen popular Democratic governors run for Senate before. But one thing we always know they do is they overperform, and overperform by excessive amounts. The last time we saw this happen, I think, to a very high level was in 2020 when we saw that former governor, or at the time incumbent governor, Steve Bullock, was running for Senate in the state of Montana, to which he lost to Steve Daines by about 10 points. But if you compare it with the presidential election in 2020, Donald Trump won that state by 16.4. If Roy Cooper can do what Bullock did and outperform by a margin of 6 points, that's extremely significant and would be enough to flip North Carolina as a state that voted for Trump by about 3.5 points in 2024. Look at 2016, for instance. The state of Tennessee went to Donald Trump by 26.2%, but then the former popular Democratic governor decided to run for Senate in that state. Phil Bredesen ran against Marsha Blackburn, and the race was decided not by 26 like it was on the national level, but instead by 11 points in the Tennessee Senate race. Now that's an overperformance of 15 points for the Democratic Party and for this Democratic candidate. If Roy Cooper can do that, he wins North Carolina by far more than we would have expected. But I think we're getting closer to it being more like it was in 2020, that when Steve Bullock was outpacing Trump, by about 6.5 points, that makes a huge difference, right? I think that can be something. And we've seen it happen on the Senate level too with popular senators. Ohio voted for Trump by 11.2. Ohio voted for Bernie Moreno by 3.6%. So it certainly can happen and very likely will happen in the state of North Carolina in 2026. And so it's nowhere outside of the realm of possibility. But there have been times where the Republican Party has defeated popular Republican incumbents, but a lot of it relies on states that are more inclined to vote for the Republican Party to greater degrees. States like Montana, states like Tennessee that are pretty locked in for their political party and don't like to deviate. And even if they do, the amount of support for the GOP there is so heavy that slight deviations or even 15-point deviations don't even make a dent in terms of partisan control in this state. And so now seeing Roy Cooper going into a swing state, I mean, this is probably one of the best recruits, Democrats, incumbents included, Democrats could have had in the Senate elections in 2026. This is a very, very solid victory for Democrats alone. And to see that he's already starting out with this advantage absolutely means something, because it shows that he pretty much is confirming a lot of the priors that Democrats had about this race, which is that Roy Cooper is the one who can win this race. And it looks like he might be. Now, the data can change. But if anything is indicative from those early data points from Emerson College is that not much really does change between the preliminary polling and the election day polling, even when undecided start to choose sides. Because in some cases, and even in this case, even if they break 70-30 in favor of the GOP, you will still find that it is Roy Cooper who wins this race regardless, right? So that is why you would see advantages on the side of Cooper with that preliminary data, especially knowing Emerson nearly a year out, were the same group saying that Cheri Beasley was going to lose to Ted Budd by about 7 points. Then by election day, narrowed it down to 5. They ended up losing. The Democrats ended up losing by about 3. But it was indicative. And it did show that Cheri Beasley had gained support. I mean, he started out with a pretty strong lead too in some of these preliminary polls, right? 7.5 points, even after the Emerson College poll. So clearly something had narrowed up, and they actually saw that too. The Hill and Emerson said that Bud would lead by 7, but then by the time we reached the middle of the campaign, they narrowed it to 3. They revised it to 5 by the time. And again, this is around the time that I said if the National Democratic Party had hunkered down and really started investing in heavily, maybe the race wouldn't have ended up as lopsided in favor of the Republican Party, but that's neither here nor there. The focus here is that Emerson was tracking the data. And Emerson did call it right. And I do think that they are calling it correctly today, that hold the election today, Roy Cooper does win. Do I think he wins by 6? No. But I do think he wins the North Carolina Senate race as it stands right now, barring a major change between now and the end of the year. And then, of course, we have a whole nother year of campaigning in the general election. So huge data out of North Carolina, definitely some interesting points. The brand new and first ever polls of the cycle are always the most interesting to cover because they really set the standard and the tone of the race and how much both political parties will be investing in this state. Will they give it up? Will they focus a lot? Will they spend $150 million? Who knows? That's all up to the RNC and the DNC. But what we know is North Carolina is expected to be a very, very competitive race. But today, Democrats start out with the upper hand with their popular former governor who decided to run for Senate. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.